Good morning, good morning. We're finishing up on Acts. We'll be going into the prophets next week, particularly with Isaiah, and following through on the prophets, preparing us for recovery from exile, as well as preparing us to see how the prophets foresaw a coming anointed one, or Messiah, or the word Christ. It depends on how you take it. The word Christ literally means anointed. The word Messias means anointed. Messias being Hebrew, Christos being Greek, and anointed being our English. They're the words translated across the language barriers. But today we're looking at Saul, or Paul as we might call him, particularly his conversion in Acts chapter 9, where Luke is relating it. And then, as Luke relates Paul talking to the Roman rulers in Acts 26, Acts 22, and Acts 26, he relates to them, again, his conversion experience, all on the road to Damascus. So we're going to look at particularly the one of chapter 9, and I'm going to, pick up some other things. What I want to do, and I've got a chart here, is to look at Saul on that chart, because there's a key word, and I want to pick that up in Acts chapter 9, where Paul is now blind. He's been on the road to Damascus. He's blind, and he goes to Damascus, and we'll look at some of that too. But I'm going to read a little bit from Acts chapter 9, beginning at verse 10. Now, there was a disciple in Damascus named Ananias. The Lord said to him in a vision, "Ananias," and he answered, "Here I am, Lord." And the Lord said to him, "Get up and go to the street called Straight." Now, if you were to go to Damascus today, they will show you a street called Straight. Is it the same street that Judas lived on? Because that's the home that God sends Ananias to. I'm not sure. It certainly works as a tourist attraction to say this is the street called Straight. This was where Paul stayed when he came to Damascus. But anyway, he said, "Get up and go to the street called Straight, and at the house of Judas." What's interesting is we never hear again of either Judas or Ananias, except as Paul may relate to them in his conversion experience. And we're going to look at them both a little bit more in a moment. Go to the house of a man called Judas and look for a man of Tarsus. And we'll pick up on Tarsus on our chart here in a moment. Tarsus named Saul. At this moment he is praying. That's an interesting thing. He's been there 3 days. The only thing we know about him is he's not eating, he's not drinking, but he is praying. All right. At this moment he's praying, and he has seen a vision of a man named Ananias. That's interesting. God revealed to Saul the name of the person who was going to come to him. He in a vision, a man named Ananias come in and lay his hands on him so that he might regain his sight. But Ananias answered, "Lord, I have heard from many about this man, how much evil he has done to your saints in Jerusalem." Particularly Jerusalem has been the name of the place. And here he is with authority from the chief priests. The question is, how in the world did Ananias know about this mission that Paul was on, that had the endorsement, or the premature, you might say, the encouragement of the high priest to go and do it? We'll look at that a little bit more too. He has the authority of the chief priest to bind all who invoke your name. But the Lord said to him, "Go, for he is an instrument whom I have chosen." That's a key word there. God says, "I've chosen this man." Paul says that before the foundations of the world, and he'll talk about that, God chose me. Now, he's not bragging when he says that. He's saying God has a plan. And like the prophet Isaiah, we won't be quite looking at those particular verses next week, but in Isaiah, God says, I will work, and who will hinder it? And God was determined. He had seen Saul in his vision of creation and all, and he saw, I've chosen him. Now we're going to talk about more about this word chosen. You can think of it in terms of a book I read years ago called The Chosen Child. And it has to do with adoption. A person adopts a child. They haven't given birth to that child, but they're going to give love to that child. They choose to take this child into their home. That word chosen comes up many, many times. I have chosen him. So we're going to look at that and look at a little bit of the dreams that God had when he dreamed of this man named Saul and what he would do with him. Now he also goes on to say, and I will show him how much he must suffer. That may not excite us in terms of being chosen. I've chosen you to suffer. That's not exactly something that we're going to have a birthday party about, you know. But this is a new birth for Paul. And that's going to be one of the factors we're going to look at, because at this point he's known as Saul. He will be known as Saul until you get to about the 18th chapter of the book of Acts. And then Luke mentions again about him and says, Saul, who was called Paul. And from then on, it's Paul. Now, why is that? We're going to look at that in a few moments. All right, now, this is a situation we have. We're looking particularly at Acts chapter 9 and this experience of Paul. Now, Paul has gone to the high priest. That's a pretty important factor. Not everybody gets to talk to the high priest. He's a busy man. It can be like getting to talk to the president. I haven't had a phone call from the president in a long time, like never. Whether he was in office, out of office, or anything, because I don't have contacts like that. Now, there are people that do. They come and go. I was reading a book about the former president and the access that people had. This book wasn't about him, but Abraham Lincoln had a situation where his son, Todd, would come into the room when he was having a very important meeting. And Abe Lincoln would stop and talk to his son a moment. And some of the people in the cabinet and some others that thought the business was pretty important were upset with Mr. Lincoln for taking the time to talk to Todd. But you see, Todd had access to the president. And that was a pretty important thing as far as Mr. Lincoln was concerned on that. So having access is important. Saul had access to the high priest, and we're going to look at that a little bit more. So he has that. Now, let me go back here a little bit where it talks about what's happened here. In chapter 8, it says, begins the good news. All right, that's him talk. Okay, meanwhile, Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest. I want to go back. There's a verse back here farther talking about what had happened. In chapter 8, the second verse says, that day, this was the day that Stephen was killed, and Paul was the one. If you go back up to the first verse of chapter 8, it says, and Saul approved their killing him. In other words, Saul was in charge of killing Stephen, and he was the first martyr. He was a deacon in the church. Technically, he was set aside along with Philip and some others to take care of the physical needs of the widows and the orphans and the strangers. They ended up doing more than that, both Philip and Stephen. Some of the deacons probably didn't preach, didn't get involved in the verbal stuff as much as they stayed on in the physical needs of taking care of the people. But it says Saul approved him. That day a severe persecution began against the church in Jerusalem, and all except the apostles were scattered throughout the countryside of Judea and Samaria. All right, now we don't know. Go over to the fourth verse, and it says this. Now those who were scattered went from place to place proclaiming the word. Philip went down to the city to the city of Samaria. And that was probably Shechem or one of the other cities of Samaria, and proclaimed the Messiah there. He's in Samaria. They're in the countryside of Judea. We're going to encounter disciples today that are far, far away from there, up in Damascus. Now, the question comes, how in the world do we have Christians in Damascus at this point? Well, my thoughts are, if you go back to Acts chapter 2, it says that there were Jews from all of the dispersion. That's a technical word. The dispersion means the Jews that were scattered into other countries and places and stuff. Damascus technically was not part of Israel or Judea. It was part of Palestine in a sense, and Decapolis really at the time of Jesus. But perhaps there were Jews in Jerusalem at Pentecost that were there for that giving or receiving of the Holy Spirit at Pentecost and the birth of the church. And when they went back home, they took that faith and experience with them. Now that would be my perception of what had happened with Ananias. Now Judas, that's a different story. I'm going to get into a little bit more of that later. Why did Saul go to the house of Judas? And not Judas Iscariot and not Judas the disciple. This is another Judas. And he went to that house. Anyway, we've got Saul on his way to Jerusalem. There's been a tremendous persecution. And he has gotten letters from the high priest to go and lock up, not just Ananias, but any whom he finds in Damascus who are followers of the way. That was what Christians were called, followers of the way. They weren't called Christians there. We don't find that until we get to the Christians in Antioch, where they're first called Christians. And that becomes the title for them, which in a sense means Christ-like. And that's a good title for a Christian to be Christ-like. Okay, they're followers of the way. So he's going up there. He's got letters from the high priest. He's been authorized by the high priest to do this. That's a pretty significant thing. Now I'm going to go back just a little bit, and George is going to give me a signal that says I'm out of time there very quickly. But I want to go back a little bit, and I'm going to stand up here and just do this. Because we've got Saul here, and Saul in his youth was born in a city called Tarsus. I'm going to put that on the board here. I'm losing my board, but I'm going to keep it here on the right. Tarsus. All right, Tarsus is not in Israel. Tarsus is in what we would call today Turkey. Tarsus was the capital of Cilicia, not Cappadocia, Cilicia. It was an official Roman city. It was a Roman city. And I'm going to write Roman down here under the R, Roman. It was a capital Roman city. Now, Paul is a Roman. Now, he's not from Italy. He's not of the Roman descent. He is of the Jewish descent, but he's a Roman citizen. That plays its first major role when Paul is at Philippi, which is another capital city of Rome, but in the European part, in Macedonia. He is a Roman citizen. That gives him free travel rights all over the Roman Empire. That's a very important thing on that. So he's born a Roman. When he talks to one of his captors, a centurion who has him in his control, and he's been bound, Paul says you can't bind a Roman citizen. Now that was one of the rights of a Roman citizen, to not be bound. And also to not be whipped with a whip. Now you could be beat with rods, but that was still limited. But there were many prerogatives that Romans had. And in the Philippi jail, when Paul has been thrown there along with Silas, and the earthquake frees them, and the jailer's going to kill himself, and Paul says, don't do it. We're still here. Don't do it. And the jailer says, what must I do? What must I do? And Paul speaks to him about Jesus. Now, the jailer notifies the authorities that the jail's been open and these are here. And so they've been whipped. And so the jailers come, and the town leaders come, and they beg Paul to leave town. And he says, no, you whipped a Roman citizen, and they're scared. They are scared because they're in trouble. And they beg Paul. They apologize, they beg Paul, and finally he agrees to it. Now, that's a very significant factor. Paul is a Roman citizen. Second thing, Paul had an education in both the synagogue, which would have been in the town there, synagogue. That's not writing very well, but synagogue, which would be similar to our churches, only it was a Jewish gathering place. But they had the school there. Now they would have public schools as well in Roman citizens for Romans. But he would have gone to the synagogue school and then perhaps been a student at the public school as well. But there's more than that. He went, and there was a teacher called Gamaliel. We encounter Gamaliel in the book of Acts. Gamaliel was one of the brilliant men of his time. Paul, no doubt, went to Jerusalem and studied under Gamaliel in the city of Jerusalem and got the finest education. His youth was a youth of being an elite, very special kid. Born in Tarsus, went to synagogue and probably public school, was a Roman citizen, and had studied. Not everybody got to study under Gamaliel. Gamaliel was the top of the line in terms of that. Now, as an adult, what does Paul tell us? If we go to Philippians chapter 3, Paul tells us, he gives his credentials. He says, I was a Pharisee. Well, what's a Pharisee? Well, we've heard those terms. Pharisees were not priests. They were not technically scribes. But they were a very, very elite group in terms of education, in terms of knowledge, and in terms of prestige. You had two groups there that varied from each other. You had the Pharisees and you had the Sadducees. Sadducees were of a priestly group, very well educated, particularly the Pharisees and Sadducees disagreed over whether there was a resurrection. Sadducees said, no, when you're dead, that's it. Pharisees said, no, we believe there is a resurrection. And so Paul is a Pharisee. Now, every Pharisee had to have an occupation. You couldn't just be a Pharisee. Paul talks about his occupation, and he was a tent maker. Now that's going to also be another factor for him as he travels, because when he gets to Europe, he'll meet two other tent makers. One is they're Aquila and Priscilla, husband and wife. He will stay with them. They will provide lodging, and he will provide for his support by helping to make tents. That was a requirement if you were going to be a Pharisee. You had to have an occupation. So he probably learned this back in Tarsus. Probably his dad was a Pharisee as well. And a leader in the community that he had. He had to have money. If you're going to send your boy to boarding school in Jerusalem, you had to have money. And that was there for him. Now he's a Pharisee, he's a tent maker. And again, he talks about, I'm of the tribe of Benjamin. Saul, the first king of Israel, was of the tribe of Benjamin. That's like a good credit card. He's got all that. Now, then he goes to the next thing. And he has Z-E-A-L. Zeal. He said, as touching the zeal, I was zealous. Nobody was more zealous. Nobody was more ambitious. Nobody was more driven than I was to do what I believe God wanted me to do. Now, Saul believed that was to be a persecutor of the Christians, to get rid of them, to wipe them out. And so he did that with zeal. He had a bad reputation. Ananias already knew about him and coming to Damascus when all of this happened. Now, here's the other thing, and I put HP. That stands for high priest. He had letters from the high priest to go there and to give him a chair back here and to get those Christians and all of that. Now that's Paul. That's Saul. The other thing about it is Paul has another name. Saul has another name. Saul is his Hebrew name. Paulus is his Latin or Roman name. Now there are others in the Bible that have two names. You have Simon Peter. Simon is a Hebrew name. It's a good Hebrew name. There's a lot of Simons in the Bible. Simon was the old man in the temple that was waiting for Jesus to come. And, we have good names like that. But the Peter part is a name that Jesus gave to Simon, which we get our word petrified, or Petros, or I'm trying to think of another word, but it means stone. Now in Hebrew it's Cephas, but Peter uses, we have the English translation of it and the Greek translation of it. So there's a kind of an indication that, Peter, you're going to be my witness in the world. And it does. It ends up, Peter goes to Rome, is a witness for Christ there. Paul will use that name Paul from here on out because it's his Roman name. And it gets him into places that he couldn't get by just being called Saul. The Romans are not impressed with him being of the tribe of Benjamin. Hebrews might well be. His dad named him Saul for a reason, because that carried with it a lot of prestige. But he's going to function as Paul, and it's going to be his ticket to get around in this world. Now, Paul is very practical. He wants to get rid of the Christians. There's a major way of getting rid of Christians: executing them. And that's what Paul is doing. He's got letters to bind them, bring them to Jerusalem so that they can be executed. And he was in charge of the execution of the first man who died for being a Christian. That was Stephen. He wanted to get rid of many, many more. And the Romans did try to do that. Now, not necessarily with Saul Paul, but they thought, we'll get rid of him. It's kind of like Hitler thought he could get rid of the Jews by killing, and he killed millions of them. But they replenished. Tertullian, an early Christian apologist, said the Romans tried to execute as many Christians as they could, and he said, we reproduced. Now, not having children, but many became Christians because they saw this faith as authentic and real. And that had to be a factor on Paul. I mean, when he saw Stephen being stoned, and Stephen said, Father, forgive them, they don't know what they're doing. Well, that's the words of Jesus from the cross. And I'm sure that Saul had heard about this. And he saw Stephen dying in a way that was similar. It didn't change him, it made him mad. Because he couldn't make him yell for mercy or anything like that. He died with valiance. And that's how many of the early Christians did. You think of some of them put in the arena and a sword held to their head. If you will deny Christ, you will live. And they wouldn't. And the sword was entered, or the lions came out, and amazing stuff. Now this is the stuff that's happened to Paul as he's going to Damascus. And there's a vision that happens, a light. If you read the different stories of his conversion, in one, the people who accompanied him heard something, but Paul says they didn't hear the voice, they just heard something. Maybe thunder or something like that. Kind of like Jesus up on the mountain, when Jesus heard the voice of God saying, you are my beloved Son, with you I am well pleased. And it says there was like thunder on the mountain. So sometimes God lets others hear it, sometimes they just hear a noise, but the voice is to the one he's speaking to. And so there was that voice, and then he has this group with him, and they go on into Damascus. Now, why did they go to the house of Judas? There's nothing in the vision that tells us that he should go there. Had he made arrangements with this good Jew in Damascus to stay there while he was going out and gathering up Christians? Was that what happened during the 3 days that he was there, when he didn't eat or drink and he prayed? Did he talk to Judas? Did he tell him about his vision like he's telling people here about it, like he tells the Roman rulers about it? Did it make a difference in Judas's life in those 3 days that he was there? Certainly, we know when God appeared to Ananias in that vision, whether it was a dream or however it was, Ananias really wasn't keen on going there. Had he heard about Judas? And was Judas one against the Christians as well as Saul? Had God worked with him? And how does God work with us too? Yeah, we may not have the education that Saul had. We may not have the bloodline that Saul has got. We may not have the opportunities. But here's the word. He was chosen. And I'm going to write it in a different color. C-H-O-S. I get it. E-N. Chosen. He was chosen. If you go back to the Bible, in Deuteronomy 7, God speaks to his people Israel. And he says to them, it wasn't because you were stronger than all the other nations. It wasn't even because you were better than all the other nations. It wasn't because you were more numerous than all the other nations. It was because I chose to set my love upon you. It wasn't anything they had done. Anything they could do. God chose them. And then he said, and I chose you to be a blessing to others as well as to receive my blessing. Now, Peter, in his letter to the church in general, says, you are a chosen nation. In other words, God has chosen you, chosen me, to be a part of his plan. May not do what Paul did, but he still got a chosen purpose for us and saw it from the very beginning of the foundation of the world. Well, we must stop there. But think about that. You are special to God. You are not just ordinary. There are no ordinary people. We're all special. Let's pray. Father, thank you for this day that you've given to us. Thank you for what you have to teach us and for your always being so patient with us and still dreaming great dreams for us. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, see you next week.